The fog rolled in before sunrise, swallowing the Northern California coastline in cold gray mist. Along the remote edge of Del Norte County, far from the cities most people associate with California, a fortress of concrete and steel stood against the Pacific wind. The prison looked less like a correctional facility and more like a military bunker built to survive the end of the world. This was Pelican Bay State Prison, and buried deep inside it was a place many inmates once described as worse than violence, worse than chaos, worse than fear itself. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU, a place built around silence. For decades, Pelican Bay became one of the most controversial prisons in America because of what happened inside those windowless cells. Men disappeared into isolation for years at a time. Some stayed there for decades. No physical contact, no group programs, no normal human interaction, just steel doors, fluorescent lights, concrete walls, and time that seemed to stop moving. What made the SHU infamous was not public executions or constant riots. It was something quieter, the system itself. Pelican Bay State Prison officially opened in 1989 during one of the most aggressive prison expansion periods in California history. Violent crime rates were climbing across the state. Prison populations were exploding. Gang activity inside correctional institutions had become increasingly organized, deadly, and difficult to control. California officials believed they needed a new type of prison, not simply maximum security, total control. Pelican Bay was designed specifically for that purpose. Located near the Oregon border, isolated by forests and distance, the prison sat hours away from major cities. The remoteness was intentional. Officials wanted a facility far removed from urban gang influence and difficult for outside networks to access. But the most important part of the prison was hidden inside. The SHU was unlike traditional prison housing. The architecture itself reflected its mission. Windowless corridors stretched beneath constant fluorescent lighting. Thick concrete walls absorbed sound. Steel doors blocked visibility. Everything about the design minimized human interaction. The cells measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside was a concrete floor, a steel toilet and sink combination, a narrow desk attached to the wall, and a bunk bolted permanently in place. There were no decorations, no meaningful view outside. A small slit near the ceiling allowed limited indirect light, but inmates could not see the horizon, trees, or sky. Only concrete, only silence. Most inmates inside the SHU spent 23 hours per day alone in those cells. The remaining hour was spent in an individual exercise yard, sometimes described as a concrete kennel. High walls surrounded the space. An open grate above allowed a partial glimpse of the sky, but no interaction with other inmates. For some men, that routine repeated every day for years. And the reason many ended up there was not always violence. To understand Pelican Bay, you have to understand California prison gangs during the late 20th century. Inside the prison system, organizations like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla Family operated with immense influence. These groups controlled drug trafficking, enforced racial divisions, ordered assaults, and maintained communication networks that extended beyond prison walls. Violence inside California prisons often followed strict political structures. Attacks were rarely random. Orders moved through chains of command. Correctional officials believed traditional punishment was no longer enough. Their solution became isolation. The theory was simple. Remove gang leadership from general population, sever communication, and the power structure weakens. Pelican Bay's SHU became the centerpiece of that strategy. But there was a controversial catch. You did not necessarily need to commit violence to be sent there. You only needed to be validated. Validation was the process prison officials used to identify alleged gang affiliation. Evidence could include coded letters, tattoos, drawings, possession of certain reading materials, confidential informant statements, or associations with known members. Critics argued the system relied too heavily on interpretation and secret evidence. Prison officials argued it was essential for safety. Once validated, An inmate could remain in the SHU indefinitely. Not for weeks, not for months, sometimes for decades. And over time, isolation began reshaping human behavior in ways even prison administrators struggled to fully understand. Communication inside the SHU adapted instead of disappearing. Inmates developed tapping systems through walls and plumbing pipes. Some learned to pass coded messages during legal visits or through carefully folded notes. Others shouted through air vents late at night when officers moved farther down the corridor. Silence became its own language. But beneath those survival methods, psychological strain slowly grew. Former inmates later described losing track of time completely. Days blended together under fluorescent lights that never truly felt like daylight or darkness. Some men spoke to themselves just to hear another voice. Others memorized books line by line or exercised obsessively to maintain structure in their minds. Many developed routines because routine became survival. Push-ups, reading, writing letters, walking small circles inside the cell, repeating the same actions every day to prevent the mind from drifting. Not everyone adapted the same way. Psychologists and legal advocates began raising alarms about prolonged solitary confinement. Reports described anxiety, paranoia, depression, hallucinations, insomnia, panic attacks, and emotional withdrawal. Some inmates reportedly stopped speaking for long periods. Others became hypersensitive to sound or movement. One former inmate later described the experience as existing in slow psychological erosion. The damage was often invisible. There were no dramatic scenes, no constant explosions of violence. Instead, deterioration happened quietly, and one policy intensified the controversy more than any other: debriefing. For many inmates, the primary path out of the SHU required cooperation with prison authorities. Debriefing meant providing information about gang structures, leadership, criminal activity, and prison operations. In exchange, inmates could potentially leave isolation and transfer into another facility. But inside prison culture, informing carries severe consequences. An inmate labeled as a cooperator could become a target permanently. Because of that, some men chose to remain in isolation rather than risk retaliation. Years passed, then more years. Some inmates spent 10, 15, even 20 years inside solitary confinement at Pelican Bay. Outside prison walls, families and legal organizations increasingly challenged the system. Former inmates described psychological effects that continued long after release. Human rights advocates questioned whether indefinite isolation crossed constitutional lines. But inside the prison, officials defended the SHU as necessary. They pointed to organized prison violence, murders ordered behind bars, and gang networks capable of controlling entire yards from inside cells. To them, Pelican Bay represented containment. To critics, it represented something else entirely: an experiment in extreme isolation. And eventually, the pressure surrounding the SHU reached a breaking point. Because inside those concrete cells, inmates who once belonged to rival prison factions began organizing together in ways California prisons had rarely seen before. What happened next would force the entire country to look directly at Pelican Bay. And for the first time, the silence inside the SHU would become impossible to ignore. By 2011, the silence inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit had lasted for decades. Behind steel doors and concrete walls, hundreds of inmates continued living in near-total isolation. Some had spent more than 10 years inside the SHU. Others had crossed the 20-year mark. Many no longer measured time by holidays, seasons, or even years. They measure it by meal trays, by count procedures, by footsteps outside the cell. The routine never changed. Lights on. Breakfast through the slot. Hours alone. 1 hour inside a concrete exercise yard. Lights out. Then the cycle repeated again. But beneath that routine, pressure had been building for years. And eventually, the men inside the SHU reached a conclusion that would alter California prison history. If nobody outside could hear them, they would force the system to look directly at them. The first hunger strike began in July 2011. It started inside Pelican Bay, but what made it extraordinary was not simply the protest itself. It was the cooperation behind it. California prison politics had long been divided along racial and gang lines. Rival groups rarely worked together. Violence and mistrust shaped daily life inside maximum security institutions. Yet inside the SHU, something unusual happened. Inmates from different prison factions coordinated a unified protest. The demands were specific: end indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation, improve food quality, reduce group punishments, expand educational opportunities and programming, create meaningful review procedures for inmates held in isolation. For prison officials, the strike created a dangerous situation. Pelican Bay housed some of the most heavily monitored inmates in California. Any organized movement inside the SHU immediately triggered security concerns. But the protest spread quickly. Thousands of inmates across California prisons joined in solidarity. Facilities far beyond Pelican Bay began reporting meal refusals. Administrators monitored medical conditions closely as the strike gained national attention. For years, the SHU had existed mostly outside public awareness. Now cameras, journalists, attorneys, and human rights advocates were paying attention. The hunger strike transformed Pelican Bay from an isolated prison issue into a national debate about solitary confinement itself. California officials defended the SHU system forcefully. They argued that isolation prevented prison violence and disrupted gang leadership structures. According to corrections officials, removing influential gang members from general population reduced assaults, murders, and organized criminal activity behind bars. Supporters of the SHU believed the system protected both staff and inmates. Critics argued it was psychological punishment without meaningful limits. And the longer the strike continued, the more uncomfortable the debate became. Inside the prison, medical staff monitored inmates refusing food. Weight loss became severe for some participants. Blood pressure dropped. Weakness spread through housing units. Officers documented conditions constantly, uncertain how far the protest might go. Yet large-scale violence never erupted. That detail mattered, because many outside observers began asking a difficult question. If inmates from rival groups could organize peacefully across racial divisions, what did that suggest about the prison system they were protesting? The answer was complicated. Years inside isolation had changed the social dynamics of the SHU. Rivalries still existed, but prolonged confinement had also created shared resentment toward the conditions themselves. Men who once communicated only through prison politics now found common ground through survival. The hunger strike ended after negotiations and promises of policy review. But the conflict was far from over. In 2013, another even larger hunger strike erupted across California prisons. This time, participation reached tens of thousands of inmates statewide. The protest became impossible to dismiss. National media outlets covered the story extensively. Legal experts debated whether prolonged solitary confinement violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Psychologists testified about the mental effects of long-term isolation. And at the center of every conversation stood Pelican Bay. The prison had become a symbol. But beyond the legal arguments and political debates, daily life inside the SHU remained brutally repetitive. Survival inside isolation required mental discipline. Former inmates later described creating strict personal schedules simply to stay psychologically stable. Some exercised for hours in tiny spaces. Others read every book they could obtain repeatedly. Many wrote letters constantly, even when responses rarely came. Routine became resistance. Some inmates memorized entire novels. Some studied dictionaries word by word. Others paced the same path across the cell floor thousands of times each day. But isolation affected everyone differently. Men who entered the SHU in their 20s sometimes emerged decades later middle-aged, emotionally withdrawn, and overwhelmed by ordinary interaction. Former inmates later described experiencing panic in crowded environments. Grocery stores felt chaotic. Family gatherings became unbearable. Noise itself could trigger anxiety. One former SHU inmate described hearing normal conversation after release and feeling physically disoriented because his brain had adapted to silence. The psychological effects extended beyond prison walls. Families carried their own burden. Pelican Bay's remote location near the Oregon border made visits difficult and expensive. For relatives living in Southern California, reaching a prison often meant hours of driving through isolated highways and forests. And once families arrived, visits still occurred behind thick glass. No handshakes, no hugs, no physical contact. Parents spoke to sons through telephones separated by barriers that never moved. Children pressed their hands against windows that could not respond. For some families, years passed without human touch. Those details became central to growing criticism of the SHU system. Advocates argued that prolonged sensory deprivation damaged not only inmates, but entire family structures connected to them. Former correctional staff also began speaking publicly about the emotional strain of working inside extreme isolation units. Because the SHU affected officers too. Working those housing units meant spending shifts surrounded by near silence, interrupted only by metal doors, distant shouting, and procedural routines. Officers conducted welfare checks, monitored behavior, documented movement, and prepared for occasional cell extractions involving inmates in psychological crisis. Some officers viewed the SHU as necessary and orderly. Others privately questioned how long any human being could remain isolated without consequences. And eventually, the court stepped in. In 2012, a major class action lawsuit challenged California's solitary confinement system directly. The case became known as Ashker versus Governor of California. The plaintiffs included inmates who had spent years, in some cases decades, inside the SHU. The lawsuit argued that indefinite solitary confinement, based primarily on gang validation, violated constitutional protections and denied inmates meaningful due process. The case moved slowly, but public pressure continued building. Experts testified about hallucinations, emotional deterioration, anxiety disorders, and the cognitive impact of long-term isolation. Corrections officials defended the SHU as essential for maintaining prison safety. Then, in 2015, California agreed to a landmark settlement. The state would significantly reduce indefinite solitary confinement practices. Gang validation procedures would change. Many long-term SHU inmates would transition into step-down programs or transfer into general population units. For some inmates, it meant stepping into open prison yards for the first time in decades. But freedom from isolation did not automatically erase its effects. Imagine spending 20 years inside an 8 by 10-foot concrete room, then suddenly entering an environment filled with hundreds of voices, unpredictable movement, noise, and human interaction. Some inmates adapted slowly. Others struggled immediately. A few reportedly requested returns to isolation because normal prison activity felt psychologically overwhelming. The SHU itself was changing, but the damage left behind remained far more difficult to measure. And as California attempted reforms, another question emerged inside Pelican Bay's walls. If isolation had not truly destroyed prison gang structures after all those years, then what exactly had the SHU accomplished? When California agreed to reform Pelican Bay's SHU system in 2015, the decision marked the end of an era. But it did not erase what had already happened inside those concrete walls. The cells still existed. The steel doors still closed with the same mechanical echo. The fluorescent lights still hummed through the corridors. And hundreds of men who had spent years, sometimes decades, in isolation now faced a different kind of challenge. Re-entering human contact. For some inmates, stepping out of the SHU felt less like freedom and more like entering a world they no longer understood. The prison system introduced what officials call the step-down program. Instead of remaining in indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation, inmates would gradually transition through phases involving increased privileges, monitored interaction, and limited programming. On paper, it looked like reform. Inside prison walls, reality was far more complicated. Many of the men leaving the SHU had been isolated so long that California prison culture itself had changed around them. Alliances had shifted. New gang structures had emerged. Old reputations had faded while new ones formed. Some former SHU inmates entered general population carrying decades-old reputations that still held weight. Others entered under suspicion. Rumors spread quickly inside prison environments. If an inmate left the SHU, questions immediately followed. Had he cooperated with officials? Had he debriefed? Had he provided information? Even when official records showed otherwise, perception alone could create danger. And for inmates who had spent years in silence, adjusting to crowded prison yards was psychologically overwhelming. Noise became difficult. Movement felt unpredictable. Simple human interaction suddenly required emotional energy many no longer possessed. Former inmates later described experiencing sensory overload from ordinary prison sounds. Weight piles clanking in exercise yards, conversations echoing across chow halls, officers yelling count instructions. One inmate reportedly compared the experience to stepping from darkness into floodlights after years underground. The transition revealed something important about prolonged isolation. The human mind adapts to confinement, and once adapted, returning to normal interaction becomes its own struggle. Correctional officers monitored these transitions carefully. Pelican Bay remained one of California's highest security facilities, and administrators worried about violence if reforms failed. The original justification for the SHU had always centered on control. Officials argued isolation prevented organized assaults and weakened gang leadership. Now the state faced a new challenge. Could safety be maintained without relying on decades-long solitary confinement? Inside Pelican Bay, surveillance remained constant. Officers observed movement patterns, monitored communication, reviewed intelligence reports, and tracked shifting prison alliances. The prison's architecture itself reinforced control. Housing units were designed for visibility, electronic operation, and rapid lockdown procedures. Even after reforms, the culture of constant monitoring remained deeply embedded. Because despite national criticism, prison officials still faced real violence inside California's correctional system. That tension, security versus humanity, became the defining question surrounding Pelican Bay. Supporters of the SHU argued the system had disrupted dangerous criminal organizations. They pointed to reductions in coordinated prison assaults and gang operations after influential leaders were isolated. Critics argued the psychological damage outweighed any security benefits, and both sides could point to evidence supporting their claims. That uncertainty is part of why Pelican Bay remains so controversial today. The debate was never simple, because the prison itself was built around fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of organized violence. Fear that prison gangs could dominate entire institutions if left unchecked. The SHU represented the most extreme solution California created in response to those fears. And over time, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Former inmates released from long-term isolation often struggled with ordinary life outside prison walls. Some described panic attacks in crowded spaces. Others found eye contact uncomfortable after years of avoiding direct interaction. Grocery stores felt chaotic. Traffic noise became overwhelming. Human touch itself became unfamiliar. Families described emotional reunions shaped by awkwardness and distance rather than relief. Children had grown into adults during years of non-contact visits behind glass. Parents aged while driving hundreds of miles for brief monitored conversations through telephones. For some inmates, the outside world no longer felt real. Yet not every story ended the same way. Some former SHU inmates rebuilt their lives after release. A number became advocates against prolonged solitary confinement. speaking publicly about psychological survival inside isolation units. Others withdrew quietly from public attention altogether. Some returned to prison. Some disappeared into ordinary life, carrying experiences few people could truly understand. Meanwhile, Pelican Bay itself continued evolving. Isolation units still existed, but policies surrounding long-term solitary confinement changed significantly after the legal settlements and public scrutiny of the 2010s. Reviews became more structured. Time limits grew clearer. Gang validation procedures faced greater oversight. The original SHU system, where inmates could remain isolated indefinitely for years based largely on affiliation, had largely ended. But the legacy remained embedded in American corrections history. Across the United States, prisons and courts began re-evaluating solitary confinement practices. Human rights organizations cited Pelican Bay as evidence of the psychological risks associated with prolonged isolation. Legal scholars debated constitutional limits on segregation. Other states examined their own supermax systems under increasing scrutiny. Pelican Bay became more than a prison. It became a national case study. And perhaps the most unsettling part of that legacy is how invisible much of the damage appeared. There were no constant riots inside the SHU. No daily scenes of chaos. The harm, when it occurred, often emerged slowly, quietly. A man who stopped speaking. A man unable to tolerate crowds after release. A man who slept only in total silence because ordinary sounds triggered anxiety. Isolation rarely leaves visible scars, but its effects can follow people for years. Today, the prison still stands against the Northern California coastline where cold Pacific air drifts through the redwood forests each morning. Count procedures continue. Steel doors still close. Officers still patrol concrete corridors designed decades ago for total control. But the era of disappearing inmates into near-permanent silence changed how America viewed solitary confinement forever. And the questions raised by Pelican Bay remain unresolved. How far should punishment go? When does security become psychological damage? Can isolation control violence without damaging the human mind? There are no easy answers. Supporters of strict prison control argue dangerous institutions require extreme measures. Critics argue prolonged isolation crosses moral and constitutional boundaries. Pelican Bay sits directly at the center of that conflict because the SHU was never simply about one prison. It represented a larger belief within the American correctional system, the idea that control could be maintained through separation, silence, and sensory deprivation. For years, that belief shaped policy. Then came the hunger strikes, the lawsuits, the testimonies, the growing recognition that even inside maximum security prisons, human psychology has limits. Concrete walls can isolate people physically, but eventually, the silence inside those walls reached the outside world. And once the public began listening, the system could no longer operate entirely in the shadows. In the end, Pelican Bay's story is not about simple heroes or villains. It is about fear, power, survival, and the difficult balance between security and humanity. It is about a prison system trying to control violence while confronting the psychological cost of isolation. And it is about men who spent years inside concrete boxes waiting for time itself to move forward. Some survived by creating routines. Some survived through silence. Some never fully recovered. As the fog settles each morning over the coastline of Northern California, Pelican Bay remains standing, a fortress shaped by one of the most controversial prison experiments in modern American history. The cells remain, the questions remain, and long after the steel doors close, the legacy of the SHU continues echoing far beyond those walls.